Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories. Please like and subscribe, and hit that notification icon so you never miss out. Now on with the stories.
My wife Sheila and I had lived in our little slice of Florida paradise for over a decade. Thinking we had everything figured out, we'd planned for this to be our final stop. Sunshine, a friendly community, good friends nearby. It was a 2-bedroom condo with just enough room, close to everything we needed, and we'd finally gotten to a place in life where we could afford to settle in, relax, and enjoy what we'd worked so hard for. That was until the letter from the HOA arrived. It wasn't one of those small, annoying notices about trash cans or landscaping. This one was something else. At first I skimmed through, expecting to see the usual updates, maybe a maintenance report or some minor assessment, but my eyes locked onto a figure, a number that couldn't possibly be right. $224,000, I muttered, looking over at Sheila. She raised her eyebrows, waiting for me to say I'd read it wrong. But there it was, clear as day. They expected us to shell out nearly $250,000 in special assessments for a pile of projects they'd apparently neglected to take care of for years. And if we couldn't pay it, well, according to a line near the end of the letter, that was our problem. I called the HOA office immediately. After what felt like hours of waiting on hold, the manager finally answered with her usual overly rehearsed greeting. "This is Barbara with Mediterranean Village HOA. How can I help you today?" "Yeah, Barbara, I'm looking at this assessment letter, and I'm hoping there's a typo here," I started, feeling the blood rising to my cheeks. "You're telling me we owe $224,000 on top of the maintenance fees we're already paying?" Barbara gave a little sigh, like she'd had this conversation 100 times already that day. "Yes, Mr. Konetz, that's correct. The board has approved a special assessment to fund essential renovations and repairs across the property. This has been discussed at the last several meetings." "Oh, so this has been discussed," I replied, not even trying to hide my sarcasm. "And no one thought to give us any kind of heads up? We're talking about life savings here, Barbara. $250,000, where do you expect us to come up with that?" "I understand it's a significant amount," she replied, without a trace of real understanding in her tone. "But the state mandates that we fully fund our reserves, and unfortunately, the costs of these projects have escalated significantly. The roof alone—" "Roof, concrete restoration, landscaping," I interrupted, my voice getting louder. "I've seen the landscaping they're charging $700,000 for. If pulling a few weeds and planting some flowers costs that much, then I'd like to meet the gardener." Barbara maintained her calm, corporate tone. "The landscaping is necessary to maintain property values and ensure a pleasant environment for all residents. Our records indicate that these projects were all budgeted and approved." Sheila, sitting next to me, couldn't hold back any longer, and leaned in closer to the phone. "How are people supposed to afford this? We've been paying our dues every month, and they just keep going up. First it was $1,500 a month, then $3,000, and now this. People will lose their homes." I heard Barbara sigh again, probably annoyed to have Sheila in the conversation now. "Mrs. Konetz, as I mentioned, these assessments are necessary. Property owners are expected to understand the potential for these kinds of assessments when they purchase." Sheila's face turned red, and she shot me a look like she was about to take the phone and chew this woman out herself. "You mean people should have predicted that the board would put off every single repair for a decade and dump the entire bill on us all at once? Is that what you're saying? Mr. and Mrs. Konetz, I understand your frustration, but I can only work within the guidelines set by the board and state regulations. Perhaps you can speak to a financial advisor about your options." "Financial advisor?" I nearly shouted. "Barbara, I'm not calling my accountant to pull $250,000 out of thin air. How many people in this building even have that kind of money just lying around?" There was silence on the other end. That's when I realized this wasn't just our problem. It was everyone's problem in our building. We weren't the only ones trying to figure out where the money would come from or if we'd have to sell. Sheila and I went to the next HOA meeting, where we weren't the only ones to show up with some choice words for the board. When the board members filed in, you could feel the tension in the room. They all looked uncomfortable, like they knew the storm was coming and were dreading it. One of the board members, Tom, a guy who always seemed to think he was above everyone else, started the meeting with a dry, "I know this is a difficult time for everyone." He barely got those words out before people started shouting over each other. "Difficult time?" a neighbor named Ed hollered from the back. "Tom, I've got 2 kids in college, how am I supposed to pay for their tuition and this assessment? A woman named Maria added. My mother is on a fixed income. Are you going to tell her to sell the place she's lived in for 30 years? This is robbery. Tom looked like he was barely paying attention as he droned on, reading from his notes. The projects include concrete restoration, new elevators, roof repairs, and landscaping, all of which are necessary to maintain the property's safety and value. I stood up, not caring about protocol or whatever order they thought they were going to keep. You mean to tell me you've been sitting on these issues for years, and now we're all supposed to just cough up $200,000 each? Why weren't these repairs spread out over time? Another board member, Helen, a woman with a pinched face who always seemed to have an excuse ready, chimed in. We didn't anticipate the extent of the damage. I cut her off. Didn't anticipate it? Helen, that roof's been leaking for 5 years. We've all complained about it, filed requests, and you all ignored it. Now it's an emergency and we're supposed to pay for your negligence? Helen started to protest, but Sheila jumped in, her voice shaking with anger. This is our home, we've put everything into it, and now we're being told that if we can't pay up we don't deserve to live here. At this point the room erupted. People were yelling from every corner, demanding answers, pointing fingers, and calling out board members by name. Tom kept insisting that their hands were tied, that the new laws required fully funded reserves. But that didn't matter to any of us. All we knew was that we were facing bills we couldn't pay, for projects we'd been begging them to address for years. Finally, Tom tried to regain control. If we don't fund these projects, the state could shut the property down. And none of us want that. Oh, so now it's the state's fault, I said, exasperated. You mean it has nothing to do with the fact that every decision you make benefits the few people who can actually afford to stick around when all of us get forced out? Helen tried to calm things down, but her reassurances just made people angrier. This assessment is for the good of the community. We're trying to preserve property values, and that benefits everyone in the long run. Well, I hope the property values will keep us warm when we're out on the street. Maria spat out, arms crossed, looking as fed up as I felt. After what felt like hours of yelling, finger-pointing, and half-hearted excuses from the board, the meeting ended in chaos. People filed out, mumbling to each other about what we were going to do next. Sheila and I exchanged looks of despair, realizing we might actually have to sell. But even that wasn't so simple. Buyers knew about the assessment and were backing off fast. Who would want to take on a condo with a bill like that attached to it? Back at home, Sheila and I sat in silence. We'd put 10 years into this place, thinking it would be ours forever. Now we weren't sure what would happen. Every option seemed impossible. If we paid the assessment, we'd drain our savings, maybe even go into debt. But if we tried to sell, we'd be lucky to get anything close to what we'd paid. Weeks went by and we watched as one neighbor after another listed their units for sale, dropping the price little by little, desperate to get out. But the buyers weren't there. No one wanted to take on the nightmare of a property so deep in debt it would take lifetimes to climb out. The last time I saw Tom, he was smiling, saying something about how the board is doing everything it can. I wondered how he could sleep at night, knowing the mess he'd left behind for all of us. One of my friends bought her first house and was immediately press-ganged into leading the HOA. 75% of the townhouses are rented, so there are very few owners present, and they need at least 3 to be on the HOA. She did it for a year and was miserable. She said that when they brought out information about maintenance, everyone voted to defer, even when she pointed out all the potential ramifications. The silver lining is that she realized what was waiting for them down the road if something didn't change. She and her husband sold their house after the 1 year and have 0 regrets about getting out. What's even more frustrating is that for years the people who do have experience like property managers allowed these associations to not set any money aside for future repairs and maintenance. This was great for all the investors who only cared about cash flow, but it royally screwed anyone who planned on owing it long term, or those who bought into association right when these large maintenance and repair projects were becoming due. It's a good thing that Florida now requires the reserves to be fully funded with a reserve study, but it's unfortunate for any building that was underfunded.
If you like our stories, then please like and subscribe and comment, and remember to hit that bell icon so you never miss out. We have new stories almost every day.
When we moved into this neighborhood, the HOA hadn't crossed our minds as much more than an afterthought. We were wrapped up in our project, a Miata we'd been pouring our time into for 2 years, working meticulously through each repair and modification. Then, out of nowhere, came this letter banning us from working on it. Just like that, with barely an explanation beyond their own baseless rules. The whole ordeal started when we relocated to this new place for school. We were right in the middle of grinding off the undercoat, an essential step before we could finish the rebuild. We had the car up on jack stands in our garage, stripped down to the frame. It wasn't going anywhere until we got that undercoat removed and the parts reassembled. I didn't think anyone would care. We were in our own space, just trying to get the car ready. But then, boom, out comes the HOA with a no grinding, no fumes policy. Apparently, our work was deemed too disruptive, even though it was happening inside our garage, and limited to a few hours here and there. Now, this wasn't the quietest neighborhood by any stretch. Every day, there was noise, constant hammering from construction, cement trucks grinding away, the relentless roar of heavy machinery. New homes were going up all around us, and the sound of drills and concrete mixers never seemed to stop. We figured our work on the Miata wasn't even noticeable amidst all that chaos. But of course, the HOA saw it differently. The first time we got called in for a meeting, we thought we could reason with them. Maybe if we explained the car's condition and the sheer impossibility of moving it until the undercoat was done, they'd understand. So we laid it all out, politely explaining the specifics. The car couldn't roll, couldn't be towed, and there was no way to get it out of the garage as it was. We even proposed a compromise. I remember saying, "Look, just give us a few hours over a week, or however you want to split it up. We'll keep it brief, and we'll work during quieter times. We're willing to be flexible." We tried to make it as easy for them as possible, even suggesting we'd leave and work off-site if we could just get those critical steps done. But 3 weeks later, after no response, they finally replied, and they clearly hadn't heard a word of what we'd said. Their email was just ridiculous. The letter started all polite, thanking us for our cooperation, and going on about how they appreciated the detailed explanation. Then came the kicker. They flat out banned us from doing anything that might cause fumes or noise. Assembly only, they said. Anything else? Not happening. Reading that, I felt my blood boil. I turned to my partner and read it aloud, emphasizing the part where they pretended to care about our detailed explanation. Detailed explanation? I practically shouted. They didn't hear a single thing we said. We told them, "The car cannot move until we do the grinding. We can't even tow it like this." My partner sighed, running a hand through their hair in frustration. It's like talking to a wall. They don't even understand cars or repairs. They're just blanket banning anything they don't like. I fired back an email to the HOA, laying it all out once more. I spelled out the logistics, explaining that we couldn't tow it, couldn't push it, and that we were literally in the final stages of making it mobile. But, as expected, silence. It felt like they were actively avoiding understanding the situation. We weren't asking for a construction site here, just a few hours to finish up so we could get the car out of the garage and out of their hair. But nope, all they cared about was enforcing rules they didn't even understand. Meanwhile, we had another nightmare on our hands, our neighbor, who seemed to have a personal vendetta against us. This guy, who was already notorious in the neighborhood for his aggressive behavior, apparently took our car work as some kind of personal affront. We'd barely spoken to him, but he'd throw these nasty glares our way every time we stepped outside. It didn't stop there either. He started verbally harassing us, cursing us out over the most trivial things. Once we were unloading groceries, and he muttered something about loser mechanics as he passed. I almost laughed at the irony, seeing as we weren't even mechanics. But things escalated beyond words pretty fast. One afternoon, we were doing some quiet work in the garage, when we heard him yelling something outside. Ignoring him didn't work, so I went out to confront him. "What's your problem?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. He sneered, pointing toward our garage. "This neighborhood isn't a junkyard, you know. Go back to the dump where you came from." My hands clenched at my sides, but I held back. "We're doing everything by the book. We've cleared it with the HOA," he rolled his eyes. "Doesn't look that way to me. You keep pushing your luck, you'll regret it." The situation felt so surreal. Here we were, just trying to get a car ready to leave, and suddenly we were caught between an impossible HOA and a neighbor who seemed ready to explode. It was stressful enough that we were working on a tight deadline with school and everything else going on. Now, every time I saw that neighbor around, I felt on edge, wondering what his next move would be. Sure enough, it didn't take long for him to escalate things. We had contractors working in the area, and he began picking fights with them too, shouting and even shoving one guy who was just trying to do his job. That was when we started filing police reports. I never thought we'd be spending our evenings filling out paperwork and making calls, but we didn't feel like we had a choice. We documented every incident, every interaction with that guy, because it was clear he wasn't going to back down. Then one evening we were in the garage quietly working when we saw him outside staring at us through the window. He didn't say anything, just stood there glaring. It was beyond unnerving. I wanted to confront him, to tell him to mind his own business, but I also didn't want to add fuel to his fire. The last thing we needed was him getting even more aggressive. Later that night my partner and I sat down, exhausted and at our wits' end. "This can't go on like this," I said, rubbing my temples. "We need some kind of resolution. We could file another report, but it feels like we're just piling up papers without getting anywhere," my partner replied. Over the next few days we continued to work on the Miata in small, quiet increments. But every time we heard a noise or saw a shadow pass by the garage window, we tensed up, half expecting our neighbor to burst in. We tried to stay focused, thinking about the end goal, getting the car running so we could take it off the property and finally get some peace. But the combination of HOA restrictions and this relentless neighbor made it feel like we were working in a pressure cooker. One day, we decided to contact the HOA again, hoping they might reconsider if we explained again the specifics of the situation. We laid out every step we'd taken to minimize disruptions, to stick to their rules, to compromise. We even offered to limit our work hours further. But all we got back was another curt email, basically saying that the decision was final. No grinding, no fumes. They didn't care that the car was physically trapped. All that mattered to them was enforcing their precious policy, regardless of how unreasonable it was. I showed the email to my partner, and they just shook their head, defeated. "This is insane. They're literally preventing us from fixing it enough to even move it, and that's where we're stuck." The car, our hard work, sits immobile in the garage, a symbol of every frustrating bureaucratic nightmare we've endured in this place. Our project is frozen, our hands tied by an HOA that refuses to listen and a neighbor who seems to thrive on making our lives harder. We've reached out to everyone we can think of, but it feels like we're at a dead end, trapped in a web of arbitrary rules and spiteful interference. Every time I look at that Miata, I feel both pride for the work we've put into it and frustration at how the simplest, most logical requests have been turned into insurmountable obstacles. All we wanted was a little understanding, a little flexibility. Instead, we're left with silence, hostility, and a garage that feels more like a prison cell than a workspace. This is a common and fundamental misunderstanding of how HOAs work. The board or a committee or manager, if properly delegated, might have the authority to grant an exception, or they might not. The documents spell out what the board or their delegates have authority to do. The board cannot overrule the documents if not specifically given that authority. He's grinding off undercoat, which will also have a smell, and whatever media you are grinding with also breaks down and is aerosolized. Running a grinder is loud and it smells bad. All that said, all an HOA can do is issue a fine. Grind away for 8 hours and pay the fine and be done with it, or figure out a way to get your frame to the shop.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.